Hi, welcome back to Digital Defense. I'm your host, Jordan Robertson, broadcasting to you live from the Bloomberg News Washington, D.C. News Bureau. This is our weekly cybersecurity show where we help you with tips and tricks to make sense of your digital life and to protect your digital identities. There has been a lot of news lately about Equifax and stolen identities and stolen data and criminal information, information about you available on the criminal underground. We've addressed those in earlier shows, but what I want to talk to you about today is a really interesting and really dangerous computer infection that, unless you read the technology websites really closely, you may not be aware of. It is an infected piece of legitimate software called CCleaner. I'm going to bring up an image for you here. But before I do, I want to remind anybody watching, we're broadcasting live here now on Facebook and Periscope, Bloomberg.com, and the Bloomberg terminal. Wherever you're watching, if you have questions as we go through some of this, please put them in the comment section, and we're going to get to as many of those as we can. We want the show to be interactive. We want you to ask questions that are on top of mind for you, whether it's related to the topic we're talking about today or not. This is your forum for asking any questions about cybersecurity and news of the week that you may have. So please feel free to fire those off. So again, the topic of this week is CCleaner. Now, for many of you, I was going to say for many of you, this is a program you may never have heard of, but that would be incorrect. This program, CCleaner, has been downloaded more than 2 billion times, to help people basically clean off their PCs. This is a program, as you can see here, the text is kind of small, but it promises a faster computer, privacy protection, complete cleaning, things that are just, artifacts of programs you've used or websites you visited that don't need to be on your computer. This program runs and it does that cleaning for you. Pretty basic. There are lots of apps that do this. I had not heard of this app before the story broke that I'm about to tell you about, but apparently I'm in the minority because 2 billion people did and have downloaded this program. This is a program that's distributed by a company called Avast, which is a European company. Very legitimate, very credible, very widely used antivirus software program. And this program, CCleaner, is a very legitimate, widely used computer cleaning program as well. Well, here's what happened with this program. I want to talk to you today about watering hole attacks. Now, what these are is, one of the ways we all know that hackers try to access your information is either A, they steal it from data repositories like Equifax, which we've talked about previously on the show, which lost more than 140 million people's consumer data, or they try to infect your computer with things like spear phishing, where they try to trick you into clicking on an email. But there's another way as well that hackers like to try to get inside your computers and inside your digital life. And that's through what we call a supply chain attack, or in this case, a watering hole attack. What that means is if hackers can compromise programs that you download onto your computer, legitimate programs that you download onto your computer and that you activate intentionally, if they can put malicious code inside those apps, that's called a supply chain attack, and they get on your computer through legitimate means that you have, legitimate programs you have downloaded. And CCleaner was the victim, and Avast was the victim of one of these such attacks. So I'm going to show you one of these stories. We're not going to linger long on this, kind of a dark screen, but earlier in September, this Talos is a Cisco division. They're a cybersecurity division of Cisco. They published a story, and many of the technology blogs have followed this. A vast number of machines that have downloaded the CCleaner app are at risk. And again, some of the numbers that I mentioned earlier, this program has been downloaded more than 2 billion times, and from a period of about mid to late August to mid-September, something like August 25th through September 15th, somewhere in that area, anyone who downloaded this CCleaner app or updated an existing CCleaner app, which may be on the orders of 700,000 people's computers, got infected. So they download a security program, essentially a security program, privacy program, and they get infected because the criminals had somehow compromised this company's supply chain, put malware in the legitimate update. And what I want to talk to you about today is, well, what does that mean for you? If you use this program, you're one of the 2 billion people who've downloaded this thing, what are you supposed to do? The options are actually not that great. So we're going to get to that in a minute. We're getting some questions here, so I'll try to answer some of these as we talk. First question here is CCleaner downloadable and free? Yeah, it is. It's a free app. As you can see here, there are different tiers. Companies often do this if they offer a free app. The basic stuff is free, and then higher grades are, you pay 20 to 25 bucks a month for. That's a standard model. So yes, indeed, the basic app is free. That's why it's so pervasive. That's why, billions of people have downloaded it. And another question here, is there anything besides CCleaner for cleaning? Yes, there is. There are many, many of these apps. Again, these are legitimate apps. They're semi-useful. If you're not a technically oriented person. I'm not a technically oriented person, even though I write about it and understand some of the subjects pretty deeply. If you don't want to tinker with your computer, you don't know how, these apps are pretty useful. They can speed up your computer and things like that. Here's the problem with an attack like this. Again, the Cisco Talos website security team, as well as many, many tech blogs, wrote stories about this infection. I mean, this was an attack on the supply chain for a legitimate application that many people use. And here's the problem. If you either downloaded the app between mid-August and mid-September, you got infected. And if you updated the existing app between those time periods, you got infected as well. Here's the problem with this. With many infections, online infections, there's the initial vector of attack. There's the initial point of infection. And the problem with this is, if you get infected if the CCleaner app were only hit by one type of infection, my advice to you would be update the app, the company has fixed it, you're fine. But that's not what happened. In this case, the reason cybersecurity researchers were so concerned, and the reason I'm bringing it to you on the show, is that this wasn't a one-stage attack. It wasn't just, let's download malware onto as many people's computers as possible. There was a second stage, and indeed a third stage. So this is a story out of Ars Technica, really good technology website. Dan Gooden, very good cybersecurity reporter who's been following this issue closely. What happened was, the people who got the initial infection, so again, if you had this technology and you were infected between these time periods, you may have been victim to a second stage attack. And what that means is the criminals got a ping back. Anytime somebody got infected, their computer would respond back with the domain name and their IP address. And what the criminals were looking for, apparently, according to Cisco and other security researchers who followed this, is high-value individuals. These are individuals who work for especially large technology companies like Google and Cisco and others, and then they would download a second-stage malware. The problem with that is, I don't want to get too technical. You don't really need to. It doesn't really matter what that means. But the key point is, just cleaning up the CCleaner app alone will not clean off the infection. That's why this attack is so dangerous. Anytime criminals can get onto your computer, or state-sponsored hackers can get onto your computer or your phone or whatever, and they can install additional malicious software, that additional level of attack is what really gets you. You've heard me say on the show before, it's not the initial phishing email that you get. It's not even opening the phishing email that causes you to be infected. It's clicking on the link in the phishing email that gets you infected most times. In this case, it's the second stage malware. So the question is, what do you do if you suspect you might have been infected? Well, I would look at a couple of things. I would research some of these stories that are online. As this Ars Technica story says, the good news in this is that the criminals appear to be not ordinary cyber criminals. They appear to be state-sponsored actors with a very keen interest in infecting people who work for large technology companies because they want to steal corporate secrets. If that does not include you, I think that's a point in your favor to, updating your app and maybe doing nothing. If you do work for a large technology company like a Google or Cisco or whatever, and you suspect that you may have been infected on this, your options are a little bit more extreme. Just patching the app and just downloading the update that Avast has made available is not going to be enough, to clean off your machine effectively. And again, the problem with that is this second stage malware is not connected to the app at all. It sits somewhere else on your computer. You can clean the app all day long and install it and reinstall it, at will. It's not going to touch that additional malware. What you're going to have to do then, and this is advice that I don't dispense, lightly, if you believe that you fit those conditions, you'll have to re-image your machine. What that means is you reinstall the operating system from scratch. This is typically the best way to remove infections from computers. It's not foolproof. There are certain types of attacks that can survive a reimage, but for most attacks, reinstalling your operating system is the way to go. You don't want to do this though because you lose settings, you lose any data that's saved there, you got to back it up, it's a headache, it takes hours, but if you believe you're infected, reinstalling the operating system, number one best way to help secure yourself. And again, if you believe these conditions apply to you, you've downloaded this app between mid-August and mid-September, you do work for a technology company or believe that your place of work may be a target of these hackers, you may want to consider reimaging your machine. But at the very least, patch the app because that's going to be your best bet. We've got some great questions coming in here. And for those of you just joining us, this again is Digital Defense, our weekly cybersecurity show broadcasting from Bloomberg News here in Washington, D.C. Any questions you have, please feel free to leave them in the comments section. We're getting a lot here. Next question here is, did CCleaner notify everyone? As far as we know, here's the thing. Notification's a tricky thing in cybersecurity. The only companies that are required to notify you as individuals of an attack are companies that lose your personally identifiable information. CCleaner doesn't have that. So no, CCleaner put out a press statement. They've given media interviews. They've patched their system. So in that sense, they've publicly disclosed this. But the reason, again, I wanted to highlight this on the show today is unless you follow these technology websites closely, like Ars Technica and others, you may be unaware of this. Certainly there's been some coverage of this, but it's not been as widespread as maybe it should be. Another question here is, how come this isn't being as widely reported as Equifax? Good question. I think part of the reason is because the attack time frame was limited. So again, it was about a month when this malware was being pushed out. Again, this is a big attack surface. I'd never heard of CCleaner before. It doesn't necessarily mean anything, but a lot of people had, and a lot of people had used it. And the reason it's not getting as much coverage as Equifax is because Equifax lost tangible data, complete dossiers on 143 million consumers. Those dossiers included social security numbers, dates of birth, addresses, full name, things like that, relatives, stuff like that. This kind of attack is a little bit more ambiguous because just because your computer's infected does not mean that the attackers necessarily even stole anything. It means they could, but how do you prove that? And how do you prove that the attacker stole information from your computer? Companies struggle with this issue all the time because one of the issues that companies like Equifax look at when they're breached is how can we prove what was taken? And how can we prove that to the degree to which we're comfortable disclosing that to the public? And companies struggle with this issue of criminals go to extreme lengths to hide what they've stolen and the fact that they've stolen it. So companies many times can throw up their hands and say, we can't prove that this information that we know was accessed was actually taken. So as a consumer, you're going to have even fewer guideposts in that hunt. I mean, you could just assume if your computer was infected, they stole something. They're not infecting it for no reason. And I'm of the belief in this case, even though these appear to be state-sponsored hackers who are targeting, as this Ars Technica story said, as few as 40 PCs, that's good news. If you are among the 700,000 people who may have been infected by this or who security researchers believe were affected by this. However, I don't want you to get a false sense of security. Just because there's evidence that 40 PCs only were actually attacked with this second stage malware, don't just assume that you weren't also hit if you're part of this potential attack group. Next question here is, Avast has other cleaner apps. Are they affected? As far as I know, this is the only program that was hit in this supply chain attack. There may be others that are undetected from Avast or other companies, but as far as the public knows, CCleaner was the app that was compromised in this attack. But this raises a really interesting point. I mean, this isn't just about CCleaner or one company. This is about supply chain vulnerabilities, and the way you get your apps is the supply chain. We tend to think of the supply chain as, the way computers are produced, the way goods are produced, typically overseas. But in this case, where you get your software, where you get your technology, that's the finish line of the supply chain. And if somebody can compromise legitimate websites or legitimate applications that you download and run willingly, that's a really great place to be as an attacker. And this is not the last we're going to see of it. This is a really viable, tried and true attack method for attackers. So again, for many people, It appears that most of us would have dodged the bullet in terms of being infected by this second stage malware in this attack, but by no means should that be kind of a security blanket, or a measure of security for folks who think they may have been affected, because there may have been other attacks going on as well. Question here is, how do we stop something like this from happening? The standard advice for this is a harder problem. And again, this topic is a little esoteric, but I think it's really important for this audience. You guys have great questions, and you guys are very, engaged on these topics, which we thank you for. But the reason this is important is because the standard advice doesn't apply. The standard advice of don't click on suspicious links, that doesn't apply here. You're downloading an app that you want that is legitimate. So you can't just say don't click on apps, don't download software that you want. That's not viable. The best advice is back up your data. Number one, just basic internet hygiene. And the reason I say that over other security measures is we've seen a huge spike in ransomware in recent years. That has become kind of the go-to attack method for many, many criminal hackers. It's just far easier to collect money than stealing credit card numbers and trying to outrace the banks to use those credit cards for fraud and things like that. So if you back up your data, it almost doesn't matter what is stolen from it in many cases, or encrypted and held for ransom, because you can always get it back. So that's like the first order of business. That's a first measure of protection you should take. However, there's a really strong additional protection, which is you can encrypt your hard drive. So that means, when you turn off your computer and you power down and you encrypt that data, and you lock that computer down, getting information in and out is going to be very, very hard for criminals, even if they have this kind of access. That's a more extreme step. It requires an additional password when you log in. But there are programs like BitLocker and things like that that do this. There are many of them. On Macs, you can do this as well. So that's always a viable option as well. But really, for attacks like this, the advice is when you hear about them, update the app, or if you believe you're infected or could be infected, re-image the machine. If you're open to taking that extreme step and you believe you're infected, you're concerned about this, it may be worth half a day to do that and to back up your information versus wondering, could these attackers come back at some point? Never leave an infection that you know about open, and that's kind of the best you can do. It's not really satisfying advice, but that's kind of my advice on that. Should I only use safe sites? How do I know what is a safe site or program? It's another good question. So there are a few ways to tell. When you're browsing the web, and you see a website, this is a really basic piece of advice, but it's important. Almost all of the major banking websites, search sites, and such that you use these days will be HTTPS encrypted. And you'll see a padlock in the corner of your address bar, or you'll see HTTPS, / or like a green address bar. What that means is this. That does not mean the site couldn't get hacked. But what that does mean is information flowing from your computer to that website servers is encrypted in transit. So hackers sitting on the network can't access that. Doesn't mean it's a safe site necessarily, but if you're using public Wi-Fi or you're concerned about somebody spying on your communication with a particular company, let's say it's Google or your bank or whatever, if that padlock is there and HTTPS is enabled, which you'll see if you look for it, that's a measure of security that you can take. You can say, okay, Bank of America is securing these communications, thumbs up, that's a sign, that's a mark in their favor. Again, that doesn't mean they're safe. They could be infected many other ways, but at least your communications have a modicum of protection. But there really is no good answer to this question. How do you determine whether a website is safe? Going with big, well-known websites is generally the rule of thumb. It is the way to go. And the reason for that is, CCleaner, the company that makes that product, when they found out about this attack, they published a patch very quickly. They published advice and guidance very quickly about how to remediate this problem. And big companies have, those capabilities, and it's far easier for them to do that than, smaller sites that may not take security as seriously. So I'm sorry to say I don't have a great answer for you there, but if you look for HTTPS, you look for encrypted communications, that's a sign in that website's favor. And again, large institutional websites, should be your friend on this. It doesn't mean they can't get compromised, but it means the problems will get fixed quickly, more quickly than, perhaps lesser known sites. This next question is, are virus cleaners useless? No, they're not useless. Just in the same way that antivirus itself is not useless. All of these security products serve a purpose. You know, the rule of thumb is, if somebody wants to get on your computer, if you are the target of a nation state, there's really almost nothing you can do to prevent that from happening. You can take basic steps to protect your information and protect yourself, but a determined adversary will break through any wall, any digital wall they want. Now, that being said, let's move that to the side, because most people will not be the target of a nation-state attack. So what is the advice for most people? I think using antivirus, using things like virus cleaners and such, it's not a bad thing. Like, if your computer is slow and you believe there's a lot of junk on it, there are a lot of useless programs, adware. Adware is a type of program that your phones especially, if you're downloading lots of apps, there's so much code running on your phone all the time from adware. And now this is a separate tangent of mine, but mobile phones, when you get them, especially Android phones, they are customized to that device makers and that carrier's needs and demands. And what that means is you have adware and bloatware running on your phone out of the box, and it annoys people to no end, because it does slow down your device. So as you add more applications that you want, and they're running their own code, especially as you're running websites and you've got 10 browser screens open, the amount of adware running on your system is phenomenal. So things like virus cleaners and such, they help remove anything that is left on your system that you don't necessarily want to keep. So it's not that they're useless, but they're far from a silver bullet against protecting you from attacks. And this is a great example. But the lesson of this episode and this show is, forget about CCleaner. I mean, unless you were one of the potential victims, it's not really about that company and that app in particular. It's about supply chain attacks and ways that you can be compromised online through legitimate applications, and what you're supposed to do if you do. And my rule of thumb is always update your software. Of course, that's a good rule of thumb to have, but also keep your installation disk handy. Keep the original operating system disk handy that you got with your computer, because you never know when you're going to need to reinstall it. Now, these days you can download those for most computers over the internet. But it's good to keep in mind that that's available to you. You don't have to freak out. You don't have to throw your computer away. You can reinstall the operating system, and in most cases, the vast majority of cases, that's going to be enough. Let's see here. Can you re-explain what a watering hole attack is and how it works, please? Sure. What a watering hole attack is criminals, instead of targeting people one by one or companies one by one, they will go to a centralized place where either consumers congregate or increasingly where developers congregate, software developers, and they infect people at that point. In this case, they infected the actual app that was sent out to individuals. But it can also work the same as software that developers are using, like open source software that developers are using to build the programs that we all know and love today. Like Google uses open source software. So if you wanted to infect lots and lots of people, the mother lode would be, how do I get malicious code onto Google's actual website? It's obviously a very hard target, but you get the point. So watering hole refers to places where hackers congregate and they try to infect lots of people at once because they're downloading an individual program that is infected. And it's a very effective way to do computer hacking. What should we look for if we are being hacked right now? Okay, so another relevant question, because this does raise the issue of, is someone hacking me? Is someone stealing my data, right now as we're talking? Whether it's relevant to this CCleaner infection or not. And the fact of the matter is this: if you work for a large company, there are very, very good tools these days for for monitoring and detecting many, if not most, kinds of cybersecurity threats. If you work at a big company, chances are they're going to have lots and lots of these tools. So you'll have a level of protection that's actually harder to get at home. Home networks are trickier because you administer it yourself. You don't have a security person unless you are a security person. So it gets a lot harder. But I will give a piece of advice that I've given a lot, and I think is really, really good. And I'm going to say it lots of times on this show if you watch regularly, is one of the single best things you can do, besides having good password, running antivirus, doing all that kind of stuff, the single best thing you can do is set up 2 accounts on the computer that you use. One is an administrator account that you use for basically nothing. The other is a guest account where it has all the administrative stuff disabled. So if you need to install software, you have to manually go in and authorize yourself to do it. That's a really great approach because the guest account that you're using for all your internet browsing, even if an attacker gets malware onto one of these programs and they try to infect your PC, if they don't have the rights to install it, the infection is blocked. Again, there are always workarounds. Hackers are very clever at getting around these things, but that's a really simple, very basic thing to do that I advise basically everybody to do because, again, if you're browsing from a guest account where your administrative rights are disabled, hackers are very, very limited in terms of what they can do. And even if they get on your machine, getting further into your computer is very, very hard. So that's kind of, that's one to take to the bank that I think is a very good piece of advice. Does an anti-malware program like Malwarebytes help with dealing with the secondary infection? Okay, so this raises the question of, say you got infected the first stage, you've cleaned that up. Now you're dealing with potentially a second stage infection. Programs like Malwarebytes, any antivirus solution, will be helpful in this because the fact of the matter is antivirus programs now are not just looking for a signature of a known piece of malware. That's basically that's the general thrust of what they do, but they do more now. They also look for known suspicious behaviors, like your data leaving your computer to a known bad IP address, in Eastern Europe or China or something like that, or a server that's known to host malicious software. So in general, antivirus software has gotten better. Consumer-grade antivirus software has gotten a lot better. And, so they will detect things like a second stage attack. In this case, it is, again, if you were one of the 40 computers that was actually targeted, known to be targeted by the second stage attack, your company will have remediated that by now, you hope. But for consumers, absolutely run some sort of consumer-grade antivirus scan and see what it picks up. It will almost always pick up something, and that is an effective way to go looking for the second stage attack because you have to remember as well, most attacks are not nation-state sponsored. Most attacks are not, I want to hack your computer and your computer alone. They're mass-scale attacks, and the value to that to you as a consumer is that these things get detected, they get picked up, these signatures are uploaded to the programs, and that means that if you run that program, it will detect and clean those things. Pretty cut and dry, pretty basic. Question here is, what about previous versions of CCleaner? From what I recall reading, there were at least 2 versions of CCleaner. It's a good question because there were multiple versions of CCleaner that were vulnerable. The company, again, has patched those, so if you're using it, download the patch. And again, if you didn't download the program between mid-August and mid-September, or if you didn't update the program between those dates, you don't really have to worry. But it does make sense to just go update it now because the company has fixed it. So with that, I just have a few parting comments, which is that this issue of supply chain attacks or watering hole attacks are really, really important because they undercut fundamental notions of what it means to be a conscientious, security-conscious consumer of internet content. And again, a lot of my typical advice gets thrown out the window when you're talking about a trusted website or a trusted application being hacked. Unfortunately, there's very little that we as consumers can do to prevent those attacks. That's why they're so valuable to attackers. However, we can be conscientious enough to watch shows like this, read websites like Ars Technica or Bloomberg or whatever, and to keep up to speed with this because as an earlier viewer commented, did CCleaner announce the breach? Well, yeah, they publicized it, but you have to be in the loop to know. I mean, it's not like it's on every TV newscast at night like the Equifax breach. So you have to be kind of plugged in to know, and you have to be semi-aware of what's going on, and you got to keep up with your patches, keep up with standard security, good hygiene. But unfortunately, for some attacks like these, it goes to a relatively new saying, which is that a new school of thought in cybersecurity is that you can't protect yourself from being infected at all. But what you can do is have good mitigation strategies in place for when you get infected, not if. And that goes for companies and consumers as well. So I hope this advice was helpful. This is a topic that's pretty serious and is pretty near and dear to a lot of the topics that we've reported on. As always, you can find me on Twitter. It's @JordanR1000. And please do send any questions or comments you have offline there. And check us out at bloomberg.com/technology. You'll find links to archived editions of this show, as well as another webcast series by my colleague Mark Gurman called Gadgets with Gurman. You'll also find our great podcast called Decrypted there as well. Thanks again for watching. We broadcast every week live at noon Eastern, and we will see you next week on Digital Defense.